CR101radio.com, podcasts, and more.
12. Fear and Violence. October the 17th, 1955. Good morning, friends. One of the most significant facts of our age is the constant concern with violence. When we have admitted all the defects of our times, we must still recognize that ours is a more peaceful era than most as far as the average man is concerned. The wilderness of nature has been driven back. Our modern life has conveniences and well-policed security. The ravages of war are quickly eliminated by technological efficiency, and life has more security than man has usually known. And yet, men reveal both a great fear of violence and an eager interest in it. First of all, there is a tremendous interest in violence. Film, radio, TV, novels, magazines, especially murder mysteries, feed the popular appetite for violence. If there seems to be increasing violence in the world at large, remember this, that what people enjoy in their imagination, they will inevitably try to enact in their lives. If men have an appetite for violence in their reading and listening, they will create a world which centers on violence. If a person dreams continually of eating hamburgers and malted milks, you can be sure that they will consume a goodly amount of both. If a person's taste and imagination runs to violence, then they will sooner or later gratify that impulse. The interest in violence is an indication of an appetite for violence. And yet, the fact remains that these same people are afraid of violence. Their whole world is haunted by fears of force and terror. Behind every bush and in every shadow is a nameless dread. The world is more peopled with horror than with men, and no hiding place is secure against this fear of violence. Every trip means the fear of an accident. Loved ones can hardly be trusted out of sight lest the horror overtake them. The house is always likely to burn down over their heads. All of nature has a grudge against them, striving to undo them not only with earthquake, hurricane, and cyclone, but with its very sun, rain, and fog, its nights and days. Such people fear violence, and yet they constantly open the way for it. They are most likely to leave the gas burning, the doors unlocked, the iron on, the brakes unchecked, the car mechanically unsound. They fear violence with all their being, and yet they leave the door open to violence. Why? The first man to fear violence was Cain, who feared that every man's hand was against him, and who felt that he must be a constant fugitive and wanderer to escape from violence. Cain feared violence because he was a guilty man before God and recognized that punishment was due him. The man who fears violence is afraid because he is guilty before God and is running away from his almighty judge. In his frantic flight, he finds all of God's creation to be his enemy. Heaven and earth witness against him because they witness to the Creator. And yet, because in his heart he knows that he deserves condemnation, he constantly leaves doors unlocked to violence, hoping by his suffering to atone for his guilt. Men are constantly trying to atone for their sin and guilt by holding up their own suffering before God, refusing to realize that there is no value whatsoever in their sin-sick torment, and rejecting all the while the atoning work of God in Christ. It was the suffering and death of Jesus Christ which alone brought atonement for the sin of man, and only our acceptance of that sacrifice for us can deliver us from the fear of violence and the compulsion to and necessity for violence. The man who truly trusts in the Lord is not afraid of violence, nor does he require it in his life or imagination. Having been truly reconciled to God, he has peace with God, with his neighbour, and with himself. As David said, "In the Lord put I my trust. How say ye to my soul, flee as a bird to your mountain?" Psalm 11:1. The man of God can face life because his trust is not in life, but in the Lord. He can face violence because he knows God is on his throne. He can face himself because he knows that God in Christ has forgiven him and given him new life in the Beloved. This is the inheritance of the faithful, and their peace stands not in men or in events, but in the faithfulness of God.